The night they laughed at the Omega was the night destiny quietly entered the room. Aurora Whitmore stood at the edge of the Grand Moon Hall and wished, just for a moment, that she could disappear. Above her, crystal chandeliers scattered silver light across polished marble floors. Hundreds of noble families filled the enormous chamber, their voices blending into a sea of whispers, laughter, and anticipation. Tonight was the mating ceremony, the most important social event in Mooncrest Kingdom. For many Omegas, it was a dream. For Aurora, it felt like a trial she had already lost. She smoothed the folds of her pale ceremonial gown and lowered her eyes. Around her, other Omegas gathered in elegant groups, admired by powerful alpha families and surrounded by attention. Aurora stood alone. She was used to it. People often overlooked her. Some called her forgettable. Others called her unlucky. A few were cruel enough to call her worthless. None of them knew how many nights she had spent helping elderly villagers, caring for sick children, or comforting lonely souls who had nobody else to turn to. They only saw what was visible. They saw an Omega with no powerful family standing behind her. They saw someone easy to dismiss. Near the center of the hall stood a raised platform surrounded by silver banners embroidered with ancient moon symbols. Beside it sat a single chair unlike any other in the kingdom. Crafted from white stone and silver, decorated with glowing lunar carvings, it remained empty. Guests glanced toward it occasionally, whispering among themselves. Nobody knew why it had been placed there. Rumors had spread for weeks. Some believed it belonged to a royal guest. Others claimed it represented an ancient tradition long forgotten. Aurora had no interest in the mystery. She simply hoped to survive the evening without becoming the subject of ridicule. Unfortunately, fate seemed to have other plans. As she moved toward a quieter corner of the hall, a group of young noblewomen noticed her. One of them, Lady Vanessa Ashford, smiled in a way that immediately made Aurora uncomfortable. Vanessa was beautiful, wealthy, and accustomed to being admired. She also enjoyed reminding others of their place. Aurora Whitmore, Vanessa said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. I almost did not recognize you. Several people turned to look. Aurora forced a polite smile. Good evening, Lady Vanessa. Vanessa examined her dress with exaggerated curiosity. You actually came. Soft laughter followed. Aurora felt heat rise to her cheeks, but remained silent. That took courage, another noblewoman added. Or optimism. More laughter. Aurora kept her posture straight. She had learned long ago that some battles were won by refusing to fight. Vanessa tilted her head. Tell me, Aurora, which alpha do you expect to choose you tonight? The question was designed to humiliate her. Everyone knew the answer. No influential alpha had ever shown interest in her. The surrounding crowd waited. Aurora managed a small smile. I am not here with expectations. Vanessa laughed openly. That is probably wise. The group moved away, still amused with themselves. Aurora released a slow breath she had been holding. Moments like this no longer shocked her. They simply hurt in quieter ways. Across the hall, musicians began playing ceremonial music. The mating ceremony was about to begin. Nobles took their places. Omegas assembled near the platform. Aurora joined them, standing near the outer edge of the gathering. From there she could see the mysterious, empty chair more clearly. Moonlight streaming through the tall windows seemed to gather around it. Strange, she thought, almost as if the chair itself was waiting for someone. The ceremony master stepped forward and welcomed the guests. Applause echoed through the chamber. Excitement filled the air. One by one, honored families were announced. One by one, admired Omegas received attention and praise. Aurora remained unnoticed. Yet as the evening unfolded, something unexpected happened. An elderly royal advisor, standing near the throne platform, suddenly looked in her direction. His expression changed. Confusion flickered across his face. Then disbelief. His eyes dropped briefly toward the silver moon pendant resting against Aurora's chest before lifting again. For several seconds he stared as if he had seen a ghost. Aurora noticed the look, but could not understand it. Before she could think further, the advisor quickly looked away. The ceremony continued. The laughter, the music, the conversations, all carried on. Nobody realized that something had shifted. Nobody realized that hidden beneath the noise of celebration, the first thread of an ancient secret had begun to unravel. And somewhere beyond the palace walls, a king was already on his way. The ceremony master raised his hands. and the music softened into a solemn melody that echoed through the grand moon hall. One by one, names were announced. Noble Alpha heirs stepped forward beneath the silver banners while honored Omega families watched with pride. Applause followed every pairing. Smiles filled the room. Excitement spread from table to table. Aurora Whitmore remained near the outer edge of the gathering, standing quietly with her hands folded before her. Each announcement seemed to push her farther into the background. She told herself it did not matter. She had learned to expect very little from events like this. Yet a small part of her heart still hoped for simple kindness. Not admiration, not attention, just kindness. Across the hall, Lady Vanessa Ashford continued entertaining her circle of friends. Every so often their eyes drifted toward Aurora. More laughter followed. The sound was never loud enough to interrupt the ceremony, but it reached her anyway. Aurora focused on the musicians instead. She focused on the chandeliers. She focused on anything except the growing weight in her chest. Another alpha chose his intended partner. Cheers erupted. Another pair stepped forward. More applause followed. The evening continued exactly as everyone expected. Then came a moment nobody anticipated. A young alpha noble named Ethan Hawthorne approached the ceremony platform. He was handsome, wealthy, and well known throughout the kingdom. Several Omegas straightened immediately when his name was announced. Ethan smiled confidently and accepted congratulations from nearby guests before turning toward the assembled Omegas. His gaze swept across the room. For a brief moment, it landed on Aurora. Several people noticed. Whispering immediately began. Aurora felt dozens of eyes shift toward her. Confusion flickered across her face. Ethan continued looking in her direction as he slowly approached. Hope stirred inside her before she could stop it. Perhaps he only wanted to speak. Perhaps she had misunderstood. Then Ethan stopped several feet away and laughed lightly. "Do not worry," he said loudly enough for surrounding guests to hear. "I was simply curious whether anyone had spoken to you all evening." Laughter erupted from nearby nobles. Aurora froze. The sound echoed through the hall. Ethan smiled as though he had made an innocent joke. "Now I have my answer." More laughter followed. Several guests looked uncomfortable, but nobody intervened. Aurora lowered her eyes. Heat rushed into her cheeks. She wished the floor would open beneath her. She wished she could leave. Yet she remained standing, calm, silent, dignified. The reaction seemed to disappoint those hoping for tears. Ethan eventually turned away and joined another group, already forgetting the moment. Aurora could not forget it so easily. The evening suddenly felt colder. Across the chamber, the elderly royal advisor who had noticed her earlier watched everything with growing concern. His gaze repeatedly returned to the silver moon pendant resting against her chest. Something about it troubled him. Something about Aurora herself seemed impossible. Yet before he could act, another strange event occurred. A faint shimmer of silver light appeared beneath the fabric near her collarbone. It lasted less than a second, so brief that nobody else noticed. Nobody except the advisor. His eyes widened in shock. The color drained from his face. He immediately stepped backward as if struggling to believe what he had seen. Meanwhile, Aurora remained completely unaware. She simply stood alone beneath the chandeliers while the ceremony continued around her. The crowd laughed. The music played. The pairings advanced. Yet somewhere beyond the palace gates, royal bells had already begun to ring in the distance. And with every passing minute, someone important was drawing closer to Mooncrest Palace. The distant bells continued ringing beyond the palace walls, but inside the Grand Moon Hall, most guests paid little attention. Their focus remained on the ceremony unfolding beneath the silver banners. One pairing followed another. Applause rose and faded. Laughter drifted through the room. Yet for Aurora Whitmore, the evening seemed to slow with every passing minute. She remained near the outer edge of the gathering, trying to ignore the embarrassment still lingering from Ethan Hawthorne's cruel remark. Her expression stayed calm, but her heart felt heavy. She reminded herself that the night would eventually end. She only needed to endure a little longer. Unfortunately, the ceremony had not finished testing her. The ceremony master announced that only a handful of eligible alpha nobles remained. Excitement spread through the room. Several Omegas exchanged hopeful smiles. Aurora felt none of that anticipation. She already knew where she stood. One by one, the remaining alphas stepped forward and selected their intended partners. Cheers followed each choice. Families celebrated. Friends embraced. The empty spaces around Aurora gradually grew larger. Eventually, she found herself standing almost entirely alone. The sight did not go unnoticed. Whispers spread quickly through nearby groups. Some guests pretended not to stare. Others made no effort to hide their curiosity. Lady Vanessa Ashford appeared once again, accompanied by several noble women who seemed eager for entertainment. Vanessa glanced toward the nearly deserted line of Omegas and smiled. "What unfortunate timing," she said sweetly. "It appears the evening is almost over." Her companions laughed quietly. Aurora looked away. Vanessa stepped closer. "Perhaps next year." More laughter followed. The words were not particularly cruel, yet everyone understood the meaning behind them. Aurora's fingers tightened slightly around the fabric of her gown. She wished she possessed the confidence to leave. Yet leaving would only create another scene. So she remained where she was, holding onto her dignity with quiet determination. Then the final eligible alpha was announced. A hush settled across the hall. This was the last selection of the evening. Every eye followed as the young noble approached the platform. He greeted the ceremony master and surveyed the room. Several Omegas straightened hopefully. Aurora did not. She kept her gaze lowered. She expected nothing. The alpha's eyes moved across the gathering before briefly landing on her. Murmurs immediately spread. Aurora felt them before she heard them. Slowly, she lifted her head. The alpha smiled politely. Then he looked away. Moments later, he chose another Omega. Thunderous applause erupted throughout the hall. Aurora smiled despite the ache in her chest. A small, polite smile meant to hide disappointment. Around her, conversations resumed almost instantly. To everyone else, the moment was insignificant. To Aurora, it felt like the final confirmation of something she had spent years trying not to believe, that perhaps there truly was nothing special about her. The realization hurt more than she expected. Across the chamber, the elderly royal advisor watched her carefully. The silver shimmer he had witnessed earlier continued haunting his thoughts. He knew ancient legends. He knew forgotten histories. And what he had seen should have been impossible. His gaze shifted toward the mysterious silver throne near the platform. Then back to Aurora. Anxiety began replacing confusion. Something was wrong. Something was happening. Before he could act, a sudden gust of wind swept through the hall. Several guests turned toward the towering entrance doors. The chandeliers trembled softly. The musicians faltered. Conversations died mid-sentence. Then came the sound. 3 deep ceremonial bells. Louder than before. Closer. Every noble in the room recognized them immediately. Complete silence descended upon the Grand Moon Hall. Even Lady Vanessa stopped speaking. The massive entrance doors began to open. Moonlight spilled across the marble floor like liquid silver. Aurora turned with everyone else, her heart unexpectedly racing. She did not know why. She only knew that something enormous had just changed. And as the doors slowly parted, the entire kingdom seemed to hold its breath. The enormous doors opened completely, and every person inside the Grand Moon Hall immediately lowered their head. Moonlight streamed through the entrance, illuminating the polished marble floor in silver. The atmosphere changed so suddenly that Aurora felt it before she understood why. Conversations vanished. Laughter disappeared. Even the musicians stood motionless. A line of royal guards entered first, dressed in ceremonial black and silver uniforms. Behind them walked members of the royal council. Then the figure everyone had been waiting for appeared. King Alexander Blackwood stepped into the hall. The Alpha King moved with calm confidence, his dark royal coat flowing behind him. Silver wolf emblems gleamed beneath the chandeliers. His presence alone transformed the room. Nobles who moments earlier had been gossiping now stood silent and respectful. Aurora had only seen him from a distance before. Like most citizens of Mooncrest Kingdom, she knew his reputation. Wise, powerful, respected, yet seeing him in person felt entirely different. His golden eyes seemed to observe everything around him without missing a single detail. As he advanced through the hall, the crowd parted naturally. The ceremony master hurried forward and bowed deeply. "Your Majesty, we were not expecting your arrival." The king offered a brief nod. "I know." His voice was calm, yet somehow carried through the entire chamber. A ripple of curiosity spread among the guests. Why had the Alpha King come? The mating ceremony was nearly over. All official selections had already been completed. There was no reason for him to attend now. or so everyone believed. Aurora remained near the edge of the gathering, hoping not to attract attention. After everything that had happened that evening, she wanted nothing more than to return home. Yet she could not ignore the strange feeling growing inside her. Something about the king's arrival felt connected to the mysterious events unfolding around her. Across the chamber, the elderly royal advisor looked visibly relieved. He immediately approached the king and quietly whispered something into his ear. Alexander listened carefully. His expression remained unreadable. Then the advisor glanced toward Aurora. The king followed his gaze. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Aurora froze. She immediately looked away, assuming it meant nothing. Why would the Alpha King be interested in her? Yet when she finally gathered the courage to look again, she discovered something unsettling. He was still watching her. Not with judgment. Not with curiosity. Something else. Something she could not understand. Around them, guests exchanged confused whispers. Lady Vanessa noticed it too. Her smile slowly faded. Several nobles followed the king's line of sight until they also found Aurora standing alone near the edge of the hall. The attention made her uncomfortable. She wished she could disappear. Then another strange thing happened. The silver moon pendant resting against her chest grew warm. Aurora instinctively touched it. A faint pulse of light flickered beneath her fingers, so subtle that most people failed to notice. But the royal advisor saw it immediately. His face turned pale. Alexander saw it as well. The king's expression sharpened. For the first time since entering the hall, genuine surprise appeared in his eyes. The pulse vanished almost instantly. Aurora looked down at the pendant in confusion. Had she imagined it? The room remained silent. The mysterious empty throne near the ceremony platform suddenly seemed more important than ever. Several council members stared at it, then at Aurora, then back at the throne. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The tension became almost unbearable. Finally, the king stepped forward. One slow step, then another. The entire hall watched in stunned silence. Aurora felt her heartbeat quicken. Surely he was not approaching her. There were hundreds of important people in attendance. Nobles, advisors, wealthy families, powerful alphas. Yet with every step Alexander took, one impossible truth became harder to deny. He was walking directly toward the forgotten Omega everyone had spent the evening humiliating. And for the first time that night, fear began spreading through the crowd that had once laughed so easily. King Alexander continued walking. The sound of his footsteps echoed across the marble floor, each step deepening the silence that had settled over the grand moon hall. Hundreds of eyes followed him. Nobles exchanged uneasy glances. Lady Vanessa felt her confidence slipping away with every passing second. Aurora Whitmore stood frozen near the edge of the gathering, unable to understand what was happening. Surely there had been some mistake. Surely the Alpha King was heading toward someone else. Yet he never changed direction. He moved straight through the crowd, passing influential families, respected advisors, and powerful Alpha heirs without acknowledging any of them. The farther he walked, the more nervous the room became. Several council members watched with expressions that bordered on disbelief. The elderly royal advisor remained completely still, his gaze moving between Aurora and the mysterious silver throne near the ceremony platform. He looked like a man witnessing history unfold before his eyes. Aurora's heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear anything else. The silver pendant resting against her chest felt warm again. She pressed her fingers against it instinctively. Another faint pulse moved through the metal. This time she knew she had not imagined it. The sensation was real. Before she could understand why, King Alexander finally stopped. He stood only a few feet away. The entire hall seemed to stop breathing. Aurora slowly lifted her eyes. For the first time that evening, she found herself standing directly before the most powerful alpha in the kingdom. His expression was calm, but there was something unusually focused in his gaze. It was as though he had been searching for something and had finally found it. Neither spoke immediately. The silence stretched. Then the king glanced toward the pendant resting at her collarbone. His eyes narrowed slightly. Aurora followed his gaze. Confusion filled her face. Around them, whispers began spreading through the crowd. "Why is he looking at her?" someone whispered. "What is happening?" another asked. Nobody had an answer. Then the elderly advisor stepped forward. His voice trembled slightly as he addressed the king. "Your Majesty, I believe the signs are becoming impossible to ignore." The hall immediately grew even quieter. Alexander nodded without taking his eyes off Aurora. I know. The simple response sent another wave of uncertainty through the guests. Aurora looked between them. I do not understand, she said softly. The advisor's eyes filled with emotion. For a moment, he seemed unable to speak. Finally, he looked toward the silver throne standing near the ceremony platform. That seat has remained empty for over 20 years, he said. Waiting. Murmurs rippled across the chamber. Many guests had heard stories about the throne. Few knew its true purpose. Aurora certainly did not. The advisor continued. It was created for a bloodline believed to be lost. Several nobles frowned in confusion. Lady Vanessa suddenly looked less certain than she had all evening. Alexander finally turned toward the throne. The silver carvings along its surface seemed brighter now, reflecting moonlight from the tall palace windows. Then something extraordinary happened. A soft silver glow appeared beneath Aurora's pendant. It spread outward in delicate patterns of light, forming faint lunar symbols across the fabric of her gown before fading again. Gasps filled the hall. This time everyone saw it. Aurora stepped back in shock. She stared down at herself, unable to understand what had happened. The advisor closed his eyes briefly as though confirming a truth he had feared to believe. When he opened them again, tears shimmered at the corners. The moon mark, he whispered. Across the room, fear replaced mockery. Confusion replaced arrogance. The people who had laughed at Aurora hours earlier now stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. And standing before her, King Alexander looked more certain with every passing moment that the forgotten Omega they had humiliated was connected to a secret powerful enough to change the future of the entire kingdom. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The Grand Moon Hall stood frozen beneath the silver glow of the chandeliers as the meaning of the moon mark settled over the crowd. Aurora Whitmore could feel hundreds of eyes fixed upon her, yet she remained unable to understand what everyone else seemed to be seeing. Her hands trembled slightly as she looked down at the silver pendant resting against her chest. It appeared ordinary again, quiet, still, as if the strange light had never existed. There must be some mistake, she whispered. The elderly royal advisor immediately shook his head. No mistake. His voice carried through the silence. The moon mark has not appeared for more than 2 decades. Murmurs spread across the chamber. Several nobles exchanged nervous looks. Others seemed unwilling to believe what they had witnessed. Lady Vanessa stood motionless, her expression pale. For the first time that evening, she looked uncertain of herself. King Alexander remained standing before Aurora. Unlike the others, he seemed calm, focused, certain. He slowly turned toward the gathered guests. Many of you know fragments of the old stories, he said. Very few know the truth. The room fell silent once more. Even the council members listened carefully. Alexander's gaze swept across the hall before returning to the empty silver throne. Before Mooncrest Kingdom was united, the lunar bloodline served as guardians of the kingdom's oldest covenant. Their duty was not power. Their duty was balance, wisdom, and protection. Aurora listened in stunned silence. She had never heard such a story before. When the bloodline disappeared, the king continued. Most believed it had ended forever. The royal advisor stepped forward. Emotion filled his eyes. We were wrong. A ripple of shock moved through the crowd. Aurora felt her pulse quicken. None of this made sense. She had grown up in a modest village. She had no memory of royal ancestors. No secret upbringing. No hidden privileges. She had spent her life helping neighbors, delivering food to elderly residents, caring for abandoned animals, and working quietly without expecting recognition. How could she possibly be connected to an ancient bloodline? As if sensing her confusion, Alexander looked directly at her. You are wondering how this could be true. Aurora nodded slowly. The king's expression softened. So am I. The honesty surprised her. For the first time all evening, she felt slightly less afraid. Then the royal advisor reached into a small leather case attached to his ceremonial robe. From inside, he carefully removed an ancient silver scroll tube engraved with moon symbols. Gasps immediately spread across the hall. Several historians present recognized it instantly. The advisor opened the container and withdrew a fragile document. His hands shook visibly. This record was sealed 22 years ago, he said. Only the royal council had access to it. Aurora's breath caught. 22 years ago, the exact year she had been born. The advisor unrolled the document and scanned its contents. Tears gathered in his eyes. The final surviving child of the lunar bloodline disappeared shortly after birth. The crowd leaned forward. Nobody dared interrupt. According to this record, she carried a silver moon pendant created specifically for the heir. Slowly, every eye in the hall turned toward Aurora's necklace. The realization struck like lightning. Lady Vanessa lowered her gaze. Ethan Hawthorne looked visibly shaken. Around them, people who had mocked Aurora only hours earlier now seemed unable to meet her eyes. Yet the greatest shock was still to come. King Alexander took one slow step closer, then another. His golden eyes never left hers. And as the entire kingdom watched in breathless silence, he looked at Aurora not as a forgotten Omega, but as someone whose true story was only beginning to emerge. The silence inside the Grand Moon Hall became almost unbearable. No one dared look away. No one dared speak. Aurora Whitmore stood at the center of a revelation that seemed impossible, while the silver pendant against her chest rested quietly, as though it had not just changed the course of the entire evening. Her thoughts raced. 22 years ago, a missing heir, an ancient bloodline. None of it felt real. She had spent her entire life believing she was ordinary. Yet the faces surrounding her no longer reflected that belief. They reflected shock, awe, fear, and for some, regret. The royal advisor carefully rolled the ancient document closed, his hands still trembling. The records were incomplete, he said. For years we searched for answers. We searched for signs. We searched for proof that the lunar bloodline had survived. His voice softened. Tonight, we finally found it. Murmurs swept through the crowd once again. Lady Vanessa lowered her gaze completely. Ethan Hawthorne appeared unable to look in Aurora's direction. The people who had mocked her earlier now seemed desperate to avoid her eyes. Yet Aurora felt no satisfaction, no triumph, only confusion. She looked toward King Alexander. If this is true, she asked quietly, why did nobody know? The king considered her question carefully. Because sometimes the most important truths are hidden to protect them. Aurora absorbed his words. Somewhere deep inside, memories stirred. Small memories. Fragmented moments from childhood. The pendant she had worn for as long as she could remember. The elderly woman who raised her refusing to answer certain questions. The strange dreams she occasionally experienced beneath a full moon. Things she had dismissed for years suddenly felt different. The advisor stepped closer. The lunar bloodline was never valued because of wealth or titles, he explained. They were respected because they united people. They brought stability when kingdoms divided themselves. They led through compassion rather than fear. Several council members nodded solemnly. The room listened carefully. Aurora felt her chest tighten. Compassion, kindness, service. Those qualities sounded far more familiar than royalty ever had. Then something unexpected happened. The silver throne near the ceremony platform began reflecting moonlight more intensely. A soft glow spread across its ancient carvings. Gasps echoed throughout the hall. Nobody touched it. Nobody approached it. Yet the throne seemed to respond to something unseen. The royal advisor's eyes widened. The recognition has begun. Aurora stared at the throne in disbelief. The glow slowly brightened before settling into a gentle silver radiance. Every noble in attendance witnessed it. Every council member. Every guest. There could no longer be any doubt that something extraordinary was unfolding. King Alexander turned toward the throne briefly before returning his attention to Aurora. Unlike the others, he seemed more interested in her reaction than the miracle itself. He noticed her uncertainty, her fear, her overwhelming confusion. And for the first time that night, his expression carried genuine warmth. You do not need to understand everything tonight, he said. His voice was calm and reassuring. You only need to know that none of this changes who you are. Aurora looked at him, surprised by the kindness in his words. Around them, the crowd remained silent. The king continued. The person who cared for strangers when nobody was watching. The person who remained kind when others were cruel. The person who stood with dignity while being humiliated. That person is still standing here. Emotion rose unexpectedly in Aurora's chest. For the first time all evening, she felt seen. Not because of a bloodline, not because of a secret, but because someone had finally recognized the person she had always been. And as the moonlight continued shining across the hall, the entire kingdom sensed that an even greater moment was approaching. The entire Grand Moon Hall remained suspended in silence. Moonlight shimmered across the silver throne, bathing the chamber in a glow that felt almost unreal. No one moved. No one spoke. Every eye remained fixed on Aurora Whitmore and King Alexander Blackwood. Aurora still struggled to process everything that had happened. Hours earlier, she had entered the ceremony expecting to be ignored. Instead, she now stood at the center of a mystery older than the kingdom itself. Yet despite the revelations, one feeling remained stronger than all the others. She felt overwhelmed. The attention, the whispers, the expectations. None of it felt like her. She lowered her eyes briefly, trying to steady her breathing. When she looked up again, she found the king still watching her. There was no judgment in his gaze. No calculation. Only respect. It was a look she had never received from most of the people surrounding them. The realization made her chest tighten with emotion. Around the hall, nobles waited anxiously for what would happen next. The council members exchanged uncertain glances. Lady Vanessa stood completely still, her earlier confidence long gone. Ethan Hawthorne looked as though he wished he could disappear into the crowd. The atmosphere had shifted beyond anything they could have imagined. The forgotten Omega had become the center of the kingdom's attention. The royal advisor slowly approached the king. "Your Majesty," he said softly. "The throne has recognized her." The words echoed through the chamber. Several guests gasped quietly. Others lowered their heads. Alexander nodded. His expression remained calm, but there was a quiet certainty in his eyes. He took a slow step forward until he stood directly before Aurora. She instinctively straightened. Her heart pounded. "Aurora," he said. The sound of her name on his lips seemed to quiet the room even further. "Tonight, many people learned who you may be by blood." His gaze never left hers. "But I have been listening to something far more important." Confusion flickered across her face. The king continued. "For years, reports reached the palace about a young Omega who cared for villagers without seeking recognition. An Omega who shared what little she had. An Omega who comforted strangers and helped people who could offer nothing in return." Aurora felt her eyes widen. She had never spoken about those things. She had never expected anyone to notice. "Those stories reached me long before I knew your name," Alexander said. Emotion began spreading through the crowd. The king turned slightly so the entire hall could hear him. "Strength is not measured by status. It is not measured by wealth. And it is not measured by how loudly others praise you. True strength is revealed when kindness survives despite cruelty." Silence followed. Deep, powerful, meaningful. Then, before anyone could predict what he would do, Alexander placed one hand over his heart. The movement alone caused confusion throughout the chamber. A second later, the impossible happened. The Alpha King slowly lowered himself onto one knee before Aurora Whitmore. Gasps erupted across the hall. Several nobles covered their mouths in shock. Others stared in complete disbelief. The royal advisor closed his eyes as tears filled them. Aurora herself froze. She could not move. She could barely breathe. The most powerful Alpha in the kingdom knelt before the Omega they had humiliated only hours earlier. Alexander lifted his gaze toward her and spoke clearly enough for every person present to hear. "Tonight, I honor not only your bloodline, but your heart." And in that moment, the entire kingdom understood that everything had changed forever. For a moment, nobody moved. The image before them felt impossible. The Alpha King remained on one knee, his hand resting over his heart, while Aurora Whitmore stood frozen beneath the silver glow of moonlight. The Grand Moon Hall had witnessed countless ceremonies throughout its history, but no one present had ever seen anything like this. Nobles stared in stunned silence. Council members looked overcome with emotion. Even the royal guard seemed unable to hide their disbelief. Aurora's eyes filled with tears she had fought all evening to hold back. Yet these tears felt different. They were not born from humiliation. They were not born from loneliness. They came from finally being seen. For years, she had lived quietly, helping others without expecting anything in return. She had endured judgment without bitterness. She had accepted being overlooked because she believed kindness mattered more than recognition. And now, standing in the center of the hall, she realized that none of those moments had been invisible after all. Someone had noticed. King Alexander slowly rose to his feet. The room remained silent as he stood beside her rather than above her. The gesture was small, but everyone understood its meaning. Respect, equality, honor. The royal advisor stepped forward and bowed his head toward Aurora. One by one, members of the royal council followed. Gasps echoed throughout the chamber. Lady Vanessa looked as though she could barely breathe. Ethan Hawthorne lowered his eyes completely. The same people who had laughed earlier now found themselves unable to face the Omega they had mocked. Aurora glanced around the room. She saw shame in some faces, regret in others, yet she felt no desire for revenge. That surprised even her. After everything that had happened, anger would have been easy. Instead, she felt something else. Peace. The kind of peace that comes when the truth finally stands where everyone can see it. Alexander turned toward the gathered nobles. "Let tonight be remembered," he said. His voice carried across the hall. Not because an ancient bloodline was found. The crowd listened carefully. Let it be remembered because we nearly failed to recognize the value of a person standing right in front of us. The words settled heavily over the room. Nobody could deny them. They had judged Aurora based on status. They had ignored her kindness. They had mistaken humility for weakness. And they had been wrong. The silver throne continued glowing softly nearby, but somehow it no longer felt like the most important thing in the chamber. Aurora was. Not because of her ancestry, not because of a title, but because of who she had chosen to be when nobody was watching. Slowly, the first guests began lowering their heads toward her. Then more followed. Soon, much of the hall stood in respectful silence. Aurora felt overwhelmed once again, but this time the feeling was different. It carried warmth instead of pain. She looked toward the king. "I do not know what comes next," she admitted softly. Alexander smiled. It was the first genuine smile she had seen from him all evening. "Neither do I." The honesty made her laugh quietly through her tears. Around them, the tension finally began to fade. Beyond the palace windows, the moon shone brightly over Mooncrest Kingdom. The same moon that had watched Aurora's lonely nights now illuminated her brightest one. The ceremony that had begun with mockery ended with dignity. The Omega they had humiliated stood honored before the entire kingdom. And as Aurora looked across the hall one final time, she understood something she would never forget. True worth does not appear when people choose to celebrate you. True worth exists long before that moment arrives. Sometimes the world simply needs time to catch up to what was already there. Under the silver light of the moon, with the Alpha King standing beside her and the kingdom finally seeing her clearly, Aurora stepped forward into a future that no longer felt lonely. And for the first time in her life, she did not walk into it alone.